Well, well, well. Gentlemen, check out the country girl who believes she's some kind of savior. The words of Beckham Whitmore III float through the oak forest with the effortless cruelty of a person who's never experienced repercussions. 20 feet off the ground, Marlo Brennan swings from an improvised hanging rope. Her nursing uniform is ripped and covered in grime. A head wound drips blood down her face. The cord cuts into her throat while her legs frantically search for something solid beneath them, something that isn't there. 3 prep school students in immaculate Whitmore Academy attire form a casual ring around her position on the forest floor, their expensive footwear grinding autumn leaves with intentional apathy. Beckham raises his iPhone high, filming with the steady grip of someone recording just another ordinary weekday. The fall sunlight pierces the leaf cover overhead, creating spotted shadows across what ought to be a tranquil Connecticut woodland scene. 47 seconds. That's sterling. Ashford's announcement as he checks his costly Swiss watch with the exactness of a researcher monitoring an experiment. That represents the duration a person's mind can operate without proper oxygen supply before irreversible harm starts. His words carry the emotionally detached interest of someone analyzing a fascinating clinical case instead of a life suspended in jeopardy. Thaddeus Cromwell prowls around the tree's trunk like a hunting animal, his lacrosse equipment tapping the wood in an uneven beat that mirrors Marlo's weakening pulse. "Do you think she'll survive longer than our previous one?" His question implies they've engaged in this activity previously. Yet Marlo Brennan isn't thrashing about in the wild, terrified manner her assailants anticipate. Even with the mounting pressure in her head and the searing pain in her lungs, her actions remain measured and purposeful. Her gray eyes, already turning red from ruptured blood vessels, methodically survey the branches overhead with the systematic evaluation of someone whose entire life has been spent interpreting emergency scenarios. Her wrist bears burns and abrasions from being violently hauled up the oak. Her medical fitness tracker glows with an urgent crimson light. Pulse, 142 beats per minute and rising. Blood oxygen level, 89% and falling. However, the device isn't merely tracking her body's condition. It's transmitting the data across 15 meters of Connecticut countryside to another technological device wrapped around the wrist of the man she's shared a bed with for 5 years. If observing someone maintain complete composure while suspended from a tree makes you question what's truly occurring here, press that like button and subscribe immediately. And if these narratives about concealed power and unexpected accountability make you feel less helpless in your own existence, hitting the thanks button genuinely assists me in sharing additional stories. Now witness what these young men don't understand about the farm woman they've just condemned to execution. 12 minutes prior to this instant that will permanently alter 3 young existences, Marlo had been performing her usual Tuesday routine following her overnight hospital shift at Hartford County General. The autumn dawn was sharp with winter's approach, and the boundary fence separating her family's modest farm from the extensive Whitmore Academy property required maintenance before the season's first snowfall. She traveled along the aged posts with the practiced elegance of someone who'd performed this labor since youth, her equipment belt chiming quietly as she examined wire tautness and substituted decayed portions. At 28 years old, Marlo possessed the calm assurance of someone who'd witnessed humanity in its most fragile state and developed the ability not to recoil. 5 years of emergency room nursing had instilled patience and accuracy into her very being, instructing her to identify the subtle indicators that distinguished survivors from casualties. Her hands, marked from a youth mishap involving her father's hay baler, operated with identical unwavering certainty whether she was inserting an IV into a collision victim or repairing the barrier that had safeguarded her family's livestock for 3 generations. The Brennan property wasn't impressive compared to the manicured grounds and imported artwork of neighboring Whitmore Academy. 40 acres of grazing land, a 100-year-old farmhouse that groaned during winter tempests, and a crimson barn that tilted somewhat eastward after a twister grazed it in 2018. Yet it belonged to them, acquired with the insurance proceeds from Marlo's grandfather, and preserved through the type of relentless resolve that had constructed half of New England. Marlo's spouse, Garrett, was somewhere overhead in the atmosphere flying his medical helicopter, competing against time to retrieve a construction laborer from a building collapse location in Waterbury. They'd created their own communication system through the years, a blend of military gestures he'd acquired as an army medic and the shortened medical language she employed in the emergency ward. When verbal communication proved inadequate, they possessed alternative methods of connecting across separation and situation. The fitness watch on her wrist served as more than a health monitor or messaging tool. It was a lifeline linking her to the man who demonstrated that affection could be simultaneously delicate and strategic, compassionate and intensely defensive. Garrett had customized it personally with specialized notifications and crisis procedures that would have amazed the technicians at the manufacturing company. He maintained concern for her, regarding the remote character of their land and the extended periods she spent isolated while he conducted rescue operations across 3 counties. His worries weren't irrational. 6 months previously, Marlowe had been the attending nurse when a Whitmore Academy pupil arrived at the emergency ward after an overdose at an unauthorized gathering. 17 years of age, comatose with a blood alcohol concentration that should have proved fatal and sufficient cocaine in his bloodstream to arrest his cardiac function. She'd labored for 40 minutes to stabilize him while the supervising doctor contacted his parents and law enforcement. The young man survived, yet his removal from Whitmore had created ripples throughout the closed community of affluent families who enrolled their offspring at the private institution. Marlowe had gotten anonymous communications for weeks following, voices masked by electronic alteration, cautioning her about the repercussions of meddling in affairs that weren't her concern. She'd filed reports with the local sheriff, who'd documented everything with the exhausted look of someone who understood precisely where the intimidations originated, but lacked the political leverage to investigate them. The harassment had ultimately ceased, but Marlowe understood it hadn't been erased from memory. In a community where standing was valuable and quietness was acquired through contributions to the appropriate causes, she'd identified herself as someone who couldn't be relied upon to ignore things when it mattered. The more profound injury, the one that kept her conscious during the brief hours between her hospital shifts, traced back 3 years. Her cousin Haley, merely 15 and intelligent enough to secure a complete academic scholarship to Whitmore Academy, despite originating from the sort of family that calculated prosperity in land rather than investment accounts. Haley had been discovered deceased in her dormitory quarters on an October Sunday morning, suspended from a bedsheet noose attached to her restroom entrance. The formal inquiry had continued less than 7 days. Self-inflicted death, the document determined, caused by scholastic strain and social adaptation challenges. The Brennan family had been presented a significant settlement to prevent a negligent death claim, funds that would have rescued the farm from the mortgage obligations that kept Marlowe laboring extra shifts at the hospital. They'd declined it, insisting on explanations that never materialized. Marlowe had performed her own inquiry, utilizing her medical education to scrutinize the post-mortem examination report and her expanding network of law enforcement contacts to pose the questions that hadn't been posed. The strangulation patterns on Haley's throat were incompatible with self-inflicted hanging. The orientation was incorrect. The pressure pattern indicated she'd been unresponsive before the noose was positioned, and there existed defensive injuries on her palms that had been rationalized as self-caused scratches. Yet without entry to the dormitory's surveillance recordings, which had conveniently malfunctioned that weekend, or witness accounts from pupils who'd been instructed by costly lawyers to recall nothing unusual, Marlowe's doubts remained precisely that. Doubts. The matter was terminated. Haley was interred in the family burial ground behind the farmhouse, and existence progressed with the hollow sensation that fairness had been acquired and settled by people who could afford it. Since that time, Marlowe had made it her objective to learn what transpired in Whitmore Academy's shadows. She volunteered for the nighttime shift at the hospital precisely because it positioned her in contact with the aftermath of privileged adolescents who considered themselves immune. Every overdose, every assault, every questionable incident that entered through her emergency ward entrance was recorded in a private journal she secured in her grandmother's hope chest. She wasn't pursuing vengeance. Marlowe Brennan lacked the disposition for revenge, but she was collecting proof, constructing a case that eventually might provide another family the resolution she'd never obtained regarding Haley's passing. The noise that disrupted her fence maintenance wasn't the typical sound of Whitmore's meticulously coordinated academic distinction. It was a cry, piercing and frantic, traveling across the autumn atmosphere from the oak forest that designated the division between the two lands. Marlowe abandoned her wire-cutting tools and sprinted toward the noise, her nursing reflexes superseding the wariness that 5 years of anonymous intimidations had instructed her. What she encountered in the forest was a scene that would have made complete sense to anyone who comprehended the social structure of Whitmore Academy. Kinsley Reeves, 16 years old and shaking with fright, was being hauled toward the enormous oak at the forest's center by 3 young men, whose identities Marlowe identified from the hospital documentation she'd been assembling for 3 years. Beckham Whitmore, 1/3, offspring of the Academy's headmaster and successor to a pharmaceutical wealth that had been constructed on government agreements and regulatory manipulation. Thaddeus Cromwell, whose father served Connecticut in the United States Senate, and whose legislative history on juvenile justice transformation suddenly became comprehensible. Sterling Ashford, whose family's property empire encompassed half the commercial buildings in 3 counties, and who possessed the sort of legal assets that could make troublesome witnesses vanish into administrative confusion they'd already constructed. A noose from climbing cord, the variety utilized in the Academy's outdoor education curriculum, and were trying to compel it over Kinsley's head while she resisted with the frantic power of someone who grasped exactly what was occurring to her. Stop. Marlowe's voice projected, the command she utilized in the emergency ward when moments counted in delay could result in fatalities. Release her. The 3 young men rotated toward her with looks of irritation instead of shock, as though she were an adult, disrupting a game instead of observing an attempted homicide. Beckham preserved his hold on the cord while examining Marlowe with the assessing study of someone determining whether she constituted a danger or simply an annoyance. "This isn't your business, farm woman," Sterling stated, his manner projecting the casual dismissiveness that originated from a lifetime of servants and workers who understood better than to challenge his conduct. "Continue walking." Yet Marlowe was already advancing, her medical education automatically cataloging the scenario for indicators of harm and immediate peril. Kinsley's wrists were secured with plastic restraints that had penetrated deep enough to cause bleeding. Her face was inflamed from weeping and what seemed to be at minimum 1 substantial strike to her left cheekbone. Most crucially, there already existed strangulation marks around her throat from a previous attempt with the noose, demonstrating that this wasn't their initial effort at hanging her. "She requires medical care," Marlowe stated, advancing closer despite every survival reflex warning her to withdraw. "Those plastic ties are eliminating circulation to her hands, and she's displaying indications of a head injury." Thaddeus produced a laugh, a noise like shattering crystal that reverberated off the oak trees encircling them. "Medical care? She won't require medical care where she's headed. The rope injury on her throat indicates you've attempted this previously," Marlowe proceeded, her voice adopting the clinical detachment she employed when managing trauma patients whose wounds were too extreme for sentiment. "Hanging is more intricate than people realize. Execute the angle incorrectly, and instead of a swift death from a fractured neck, you obtain gradual suffocation. Requires between 3 and 7 minutes for total unconsciousness depending on body mass and the noose's position. During that period, there's adequate brain function for the casualty to undergo the complete procedure." Her statements were designed to jolt them into acknowledging the terror of what they were trying, but instead they appeared to stimulate the young men with the type of disturbing interest that originated from possessing authority over existence and mortality without repercussion. "Is that accurate?" Beckham stated, his hold intensifying on the cord. "Appears you possess considerable knowledge about hanging people, farm woman. Perhaps you'd appreciate a direct encounter." The assault arrived from her rear, executed with the type of accuracy that indicated costly instruction and years of lacrosse training. Thaddeus swung his composite equipment in a broad curve directed at Marlowe's skull base, a strike that would have caused unconsciousness and potentially broken her neck vertebrae. Yet Marlowe had been anticipating it. 3 years of contemplating Haley's death had instructed her to interpret the indicators of intensifying violence, and 5 years of emergency nursing had provided her the responses to react when split moments counted. She crouched and tumbled to her left, the lacrosse equipment whistling through the atmosphere where her skull had been an instant previously. Sterling was prepared with the chemical spray, a professional quality container that discharged a mist of oleoresin capsicum formulated to disable a mature adult. The chemical fog struck Marlowe in the face and upper torso, instantly activating the type of agony that made logical thought nearly unattainable. Her eyes sealed shut as tears poured down her face. Her breathing system seized with convulsions that made respiration feel like drowning. Sightless and choking, she sensed hands seizing her limbs, hoisting her off the earth with the practiced coordination of people who'd performed this previously. Through the haze of chemical agony, she could detect Kinsley wailing her name, imploring the young men to cease, guaranteeing she would never inform anyone what she'd observed if they would simply release Marlowe. Too late for that. Beckham's voice originated from directly overhead as they dragged her up the oak, utilizing a mechanism of cords and pulleys that had obviously been arranged beforehand. She's witnessed too much and possesses too much knowledge. Farmwoman here has been posing questions about matters that aren't her concern. The noose encircled Marlowe's throat with experienced competence, secured with the type of accuracy that originated from practice instead of experimentation. As her feet departed the final solid branch and she swung free in the autumn atmosphere, one notion resonated through her consciousness with absolute clarity. They'd performed this previously, likely to Haley, and they would perform it again to others if she didn't survive to prevent them. Yet Marlowe Brennan had been readying for this instant for 3 years, even if she hadn't realized it. Her right hand located her fitness watch, fingers navigating across the interface with muscle memory that didn't necessitate vision or aware thought. 3 rapid taps, then an extended press, then a sequence of brief and extended vibrations that communicated a message in the adapted Morse code she and Garrett had created during their courtship. Tree location 47, crisis, tree. Position 47 seconds to critical intervention, 15 miles distant. Flying at 3,000 feet above Route 9 with a construction laborer secured to a spinal board in his helicopter's medical compartment. Garrett Brennan sensed his own fitness watch vibrate against his wrist with a sequence that made his blood turn cold in his veins. Suspended from the oak, Marlowe compelled herself to cease thrashing in the wild manner that her assailants anticipated. Instead, she commenced breathing in the regulated sequence she'd acquired from a trauma surgeon who'd survived waterboarding during his military deployment in Afghanistan. 4 seconds to breathe in through her nostrils, 7 seconds to retain the breath, 8 seconds to release through compressed lips. The method activated her calming nervous system, decelerating her pulse and diminishing her oxygen usage while preserving consciousness for as extended as feasible. 47 seconds. That's the duration she possessed to survive. And the duration 3 privileged adolescents possessed to discover that certain people were more dangerous than they seemed. Observing her suspended there, maintaining such composure while understanding exactly what's approaching, what would you have accomplished in those 47 seconds? Share in the comments. Would you have lost control, or do you believe you could have sustained that type of restraint? 20 feet underneath, Kinsley Reeves had ceased wailing. The quietness was more threatening than her previous fright, and when Marlowe succeeded in forcing her inflamed eyes open sufficiently to observe, she comprehended why. The girl was no longer secured with plastic restraints. Her hands were liberated, and she was gripping something that sparkled in the filtered sunlight penetrating through the oak covering. A smartphone display illuminated, camera aperture directed upward toward the branches where Marlowe oscillated in her improvised noose. Sterling Ashford detected it initially, his privileged reflexes for self-protection finally superseding his enthusiasm at possessing authority over existence and mortality. What on earth do you believe you're accomplishing with that? Kinsley's voice, when she ultimately spoke, projected a steadiness that hadn't existed during her earlier fright. Filming everything precisely like you instructed me to accomplish, Sterling. Recall you stated I should constantly film everything for my own defense. The contradiction struck the young men with the impact of understanding. Sterling had provided Kinsley that counsel 3 months previously when she'd commenced dating him, and he desired to shield her from what he termed complications that might develop from our association. He'd been considering consensual interactions that might subsequently be misrepresented, or confidential discussions that might be extracted from context by envious classmates. He'd never contemplated that his own statements might be reversed against him. Surrender that phone immediately, Thaddeus insisted, advancing a step toward Kinsley while maintaining one eye on Marlowe's gradually rotating form overhead. "No," Kinsley stated plainly. "I've been filming since prior to you seizing me. Everything. The statements you made about the other girls you've performed this to. The manner you discussed making it appear like self-inflicted death afterward. All of it." Beckham's face experienced a swift sequence of sentiments: astonishment, fury, dread, and ultimately analysis. "You're deceiving. You couldn't have been filming from the commencement. We confiscated your phone. You confiscated my iPhone," Kinsley rectified. "This is my reserve phone. The one I maintain concealed for crises. Sterling instructed me that technique too. He stated affluent people constantly possess reserve strategies for their reserve strategies." Overhead, Marlowe sensed her consciousness commencing to disintegrate at the peripheries. The cord around her throat was eliminating the arteries that provided blood to her brain, and even her regulated breathing couldn't compensate eternally. Her vision was creating the gray passage effect that preceded total blackout, and her auditory sense was becoming muted as her circulatory system commenced to malfunction. Yet she could still observe her fitness watch, still observe the countdown chronometer she'd activated when she transmitted the crisis signal to Garrett. 37 seconds remaining until her spouse's helicopter achieved the forest. 37 seconds to maintain consciousness and existence, while 3 adolescents determined whether to reduce their casualties or eliminate all the observers. The noise that achieved them initially wasn't the helicopter's rotor mechanisms, but something even more. Characteristic to anyone who'd matured in rural Connecticut, the profound, throaty sound of a diesel motor being propelled to its maximum capability, accompanied by the distinctive whine of all-terrain rubber gripping for traction on loose earth and fallen foliage. Sheriff's Department patrol vehicle, approaching rapidly through the forest routes that linked the Brennan farm to the broader network of emergency services in Hartford County. "Someone contacted the police," Sterling stated, his voice constricted with the type of alarm that originated from comprehending that all his family's wealth and leverage might not be adequate to make this particular difficulty disappear. "I contacted them," Kinsley stated, displaying her reserve phone. "Immediately after I commenced filming. Automatic connection to emergency services. The communication's been active for the past 8 minutes. They've detected everything. The helicopter's characteristic noise achieved them now, intensifying with each passing moment as Garrett brought his aircraft in at velocities that violated every safety regulation in the medical transport manual." Through her diminishing vision, Marlowe could observe the aircraft's search illumination penetrating through the forest covering, directed by the GPS coordinates her fitness watch had been transmitting continuously since she activated the crisis signal. 30 seconds. 29. 28. Her feet located something substantial, a branch she'd been subconsciously laboring toward during her regulated struggle, utilizing muscle memory from youth afternoons spent ascending these identical oak trees to escape her household responsibilities. The pressure on her throat diminished just adequately to permit a narrow stream of oxygenated blood to achieve her brain, acquiring her the consciousness she required for what arrived next, because Marlowe Brennan possessed one more advantage to employ, one final surprise that 3 privileged adolescents couldn't have predicted, even if they'd devoted years examining their casualty instead of undervaluing her. The woman suspended from the oak wasn't merely a nurse who'd encountered their execution location by chance. She was the woman who'd been pursuing them for 3 years, collecting proof of their offenses, awaiting the instant when she could guarantee that fairness for Haley and all their other casualties would ultimately be administered. And 47 seconds was about to transform into the most significant minute in all their existences. The branch underneath Marlowe's feet sustained her mass for precisely 3 seconds, before physics and 30 years of Connecticut climate accepted their unavoidable consequence. The decayed wood fragmented with a rupture that resonated through the forest like a firearm discharge, transmitting her oscillating back into open atmosphere as pieces descended on the young men underneath. One serrated fragment struck Thaddeus in the shoulder, penetrating through his designer polo garment, and causing bleeding that he stared at with the astonished expression of someone who'd never undergone personal repercussion for his conduct. 27 seconds remaining on her mental countdown, and Marlowe performed the maneuver that would either rescue her existence or terminate it. Utilizing the momentum from her oscillation, she drew her knees to her torso and propelled upward with both feet, capturing the cord above the noose in a scissors hold between her ankles. The method was something she'd acquired not from military education or self-protection classes, but from summers devoted to assisting her grandfather collect apples from the highest branches of their orchard trees. The pressure around her throat diminished by perhaps 20%, not adequate to respire normally, but sufficient to preserve consciousness for the critical moments ahead. Blood surged back to her oxygen-deprived brain in a surge of agonizing clarity, bringing with it the hyperacute consciousness that often preceded either mortality or miraculous survival. Sterling lunged for Kinsley's phone, but she'd predicted the action and retreated backward toward the approaching noise of the sheriff's patrol vehicle. Her thumb navigated across the display with experienced competence, transferring the video to multiple cloud storage facilities simultaneously while preserving the emergency services connection that had been transmitting their offenses across 3 counties. "You foolish girl," Beckham snarled, relinquishing his casual demeanor as the reality of their circumstance ultimately penetrated his privileged consciousness. "Do you possess any comprehension what you've accomplished? Do you understand who we are? Who our families are?" "I understand precisely who you are," Kinsley responded, her voice unwavering despite the tears flowing down her injured face. "You're the young men who executed Haley Brennan 3 years ago and made it appear like self-inflicted death. She informed me about you before she perished, about the activities you engaged in, about how you selected girls who wouldn't be absent. The confession suspended in the autumn atmosphere like a physical existence, verifying what Marlowe had suspected for 3 years but could never demonstrate. Through her diminishing vision, she observed the young men exchange glances that contained years of shared culpability, instance of conspiracy, the burden of a secret that had connected them together in mutual accountability. 15 seconds. The helicopter's rotor turbulence was commencing to disturb the covering overhead, transmitting golden foliage spiraling down like confetti at a funeral. Through the oak branches, Marlowe could observe the aircraft's thermal imaging camera monitoring their heat patterns, documenting everything for the Federal Aviation Database that would make this proof inadmissible in tribunal, but invaluable for establishing a sequence of conduct. 10 seconds. Marlowe released her ankle hold on the cord and rotated her body in a regulated spin, utilizing the rotational momentum to oscillate toward the largest branch within achievement. Her fingertips contacted oak bark worn smooth by decades of climate, capturing just adequate traction to arrest her pendulum motion. 7 seconds. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos exploded through the vegetation with her service firearm extracted, absorbing the scenario with the swift evaluation of someone who'd been anticipating precisely this scene. Behind her arrived Detective Esperanza Valdez, whose inquiry into Whitmore Academy had been constructing toward this instant for 18 months. 5 seconds. Garrett's helicopter descended through the covering opening like an angel of mechanical accuracy, its spotlight penetrating through the forest with surgical precision. The aircraft's external amplifiers crackled to existence with his voice, composed and professional, despite the personal investments that made his hands shake on the controls. 3 seconds. Marlowe's feet located the enormous horizontal branch that had sustained generations of tire, swings, and youth adventures. She extracted the noose over her head with movements made awkward by oxygen deprivation and the adrenaline surge that accompanies survival against impossible circumstances. 1 second. The cord, suddenly relieved of her mass, snapped upward into the covering where it captured among the highest branches like an accusation inscribed against the atmosphere. 0. Marlowe collapsed onto the branch that had transformed into her rescue, inhaling atmosphere that tasted like liberty, and fairness postponed but not refused. The young men's reaction to being apprehended was precisely what Detective Valdez had anticipated during her months of observation. Sterling instantly activated his family's crisis administration procedures, contacting the lawyer whose number was programmed into his phone for precisely this variety of circumstance. Thaddeus commenced the procedure of psychological disconnection that privileged families utilized to shield their offspring from the repercussions of their conduct, asserting he'd been compelled by the others and was himself a casualty of peer influence. Yet it was Beckham's response that disclosed the authentic depth of their offenses. Instead of refusal or deflection, he gazed directly at Kinsley's camera and spoke with the casual assurance of someone who'd never been maintained accountable for anything in his existence. You possess no comprehension what you're managing, he stated, his voice projecting the indolent command of inherited authority. This is how the world genuinely operates. Certain people are significant and certain people aren't. Haley wasn't significant. This farm woman isn't significant. You're not significant. Yet we are, because our families constructed this state and everything in it. The confession was more thorough than Detective Valdez had ventured to anticipate. During the 2 years she'd been constructing her case against the Whitmore Academy elite. Yet it was what arrived next that transformed a simple assault accusation into something that would restructure the criminal justice landscape of Connecticut. Besides, Beckham proceeded, apparently oblivious to the reality that his statements were being documented by multiple devices simultaneously. It's not as though we haven't performed this previously. Recall Marcus Webb, Sarah Chen, that scholarship child from Bridgeport whose identity I can't even recall. They all acquired the identical lesson Haley acquired. Procedure and repercussions follow. Deputy Santos advanced forward with handcuffs that clinked quietly in the sudden quietness. Beckham Whitmore, you're under arrest for attempted homicide, conspiracy, and accessory to multiple homicides. You possess the right to remain quiet, but evidently you've selected to relinquish that right in the most spectacular fashion conceivable. The medical evacuation of Marlowe required 17 minutes, during which Garrett labored with the composed competence that had rescued dozens of existences during his military deployment and civilian profession. Her wounds were extreme but not permanent, strangulation patterns around her throat that would diminish within weeks, chemical injuries from the pepper spray that responded favorably to saline treatment, and the type of traumatic stress that would necessitate months of therapy to completely process. Yet she was alive, conscious, and lucid enough to supply a preliminary declaration to Detective Valdez while the helicopter's medical apparatus monitored her vital indicators. The documentation equipment constructed into the aircraft's communication mechanism captured every statement, creating an evidentiary documentation that would demonstrate crucial during the proceedings that followed. This wasn't arbitrary, Marlowe stated, her voice hoarse from the cord injury but clear in its certainty. They've been observing me since I rescued that young man from the overdose. They understood I was inquiring into Haley's passing. This was designed to silence me permanently. Detective Valdez nodded, already mentally organizing the proof that would support multiple homicide accusations against all 3 young men. The smartphone video, the helicopter's thermal imaging, the emergency services documentation, and now Marlowe's testimony created a prosecutorial structure that even the most costly legal teams would struggle to disassemble. The notebook in my kitchen. Marlowe proceeded, gazing directly into the documentation device. Everything I've recorded about Whitmore Academy is in there. Every questionable death, every concealment, every family that was compensated to maintain quietness. 3 years of proof. Within 6 hours of the apprehensions, the narrative had detonated across social media with the impact of a social fairness earthquake. The hashtag Whitmore Accountability commenced trending nationally as news organizations obtained the dramatic footage of 3 privileged adolescents being conducted away in handcuffs, while their casualty recovered in a helicopter that had literally descended from the atmosphere to rescue her existence. Yet it was the emergence of other casualties that transformed the narrative from a single incident into a systematic exposure of institutional corruption. Marcus Webb, reported as a self-inflicted death 2 years previously, had departed a detailed journal describing months of harassment by the identical 3 young men. Sarah Chen's family had been pressured into accepting a settlement and confidentiality agreement after their daughter's passing was classified as an accidental drowning during an unauthorized gathering. The Bridgeport scholarship pupil Beckham had dismissed so casually was identified as Jordan Williams, and his grandmother had preserved every intimidating note, every anonymous phone communication, every piece of proof that the police had informed her was inadequate for prosecution. She'd been awaiting this instant for 4 years, anticipating that someone with assets and resolve would ultimately link the connections she'd been incapable of linking alone. 17 former Whitmore Academy pupils emerged within the initial week, describing a culture of systematic intimidation that targeted anyone who endangered the social hierarchy preserved by the institution's most influential families. The sequences were consistent across multiple years and casualty profiles: isolation, intensifying harassment, and ultimately violence that was concealed through family leverage and institutional complicity. Principal Whitmore's resignation arrived on a Thursday dawn, delivered through his lawyer to prevent the media encampment that had transformed the academy's pristine campus into a battlefield of satellite vehicles and investigative reporters. The Connecticut Department of Education announced a comprehensive examination of the institution's policies and procedures, while the FBI initiated a federal inquiry into potential civil rights violations. The legal proceedings unfolded with the methodical accuracy of fairness ultimately unleashed after years of constraint. Sterling Ashford, confronting the possibility of existence imprisonment as an adult, transformed into the initial to collaborate with prosecutors in exchange for a diminished sentence. His testimony disclosed the existence of what they'd termed the Consequence Committee, a group of influential families who coordinated responses to difficulties that endangered their offspring's futures. The committee's activities extended far beyond Whitmore Academy, encompassing police officers whose offspring obtained preference in college admissions, judges whose campaign resources originated from the identical corporate sources, and politicians whose votes on juvenile justice transformation suddenly made complete sense when observed through the lens of personal leverage instead of public policy. Thaddeus Cromwell's father, Senator Marcus Cromwell, announced his resignation from Congress instead of confront the ethics inquiry that would unavoidably follow his offspring's proceeding. The Cromwell family's political dynasty, constructed over 3 generations of careful constituency administration and strategic contributions, disintegrated in less than a month as investigative journalists uncovered decades of similar concealments. Beckham Whitmore III obtained a sentence of 25 years to existence for multiple counts of homicide in the second degree. The legal structure established by his own documented confession and the physical proof that Detective Valdez had been accumulating for 2 years. His father's pharmaceutical empire forfeited 60% of its stock, valuation within 6 months as federal regulators commenced examining the company's clinical trial data with the type of examination that had previously been deflected through political leverage. Yet perhaps the most significant alteration was the establishment of the Haley Brennan Foundation, funded initially by the settlements that families ultimately felt secure to pursue against Whitmore Academy and its enabling network. The foundation supplied legal advocacy for families whose offspring had been victimized by institutional authority structures, guaranteeing that future cases would not be interred beneath layers of privilege and leverage. Marlowe returned to labor at Hartford County General Hospital 3 months after the incident, her throat scars barely observable beneath the collar of her scrubs, but her existence fundamentally modified by the experience of surviving attempted homicide. She'd created what trauma specialists termed hypervigilance, an acute consciousness of her surroundings and the people who occupied them. Yet instead of limiting her effectiveness as a nurse, the condition appeared to enhance her capability to interpret the subtle indicators of distress in her patients. She was laboring the overnight shift on a Tuesday in December when her fitness watch vibrated with an incoming message from an unknown number. The text was brief, unthreatening, but somehow more threatening than any of the anonymous harassment she'd obtained during her inquiry into Haley's passing. The committee transmits its regards. What transpired to those young men was regrettable, but necessary modifications have been made. The mechanism is more resilient than you conceived. Marlowe displayed the message to Detective Valdez, who'd anticipated something like this, but anticipated it wouldn't arrive so soon. The prosecutions had disassembled one network of leverage, but they'd evidently awakened something larger and more sophisticated in response. "This isn't terminated," Valdez stated, examining the message with the grim acknowledgement of someone who comprehended that victory in one battle often simply disclosed the scope of the larger conflict. What we accomplished here transmitted a message, but it also attracted attention from people who prefer to remain invisible. That evening, Marlowe stood beside Haley's grave in the family burial ground behind the farmhouse, positioning fresh flowers on a headstone that now appeared less like a memorial to defeat and more like a monument to eventual fairness. The December wind projected the scent of snow and the guarantee of a winter that would examine the foundations they'd constructed during the autumn of revelations. Her phone vibrated with another unknown number, this time a voice communication, that she responded to despite every reflex warning her to ignore it. The voice on the other end was electronically altered, but somehow familiar, projecting echoes of discussions she recalled from youth, visits to relatives she hadn't observed in years. I understand what genuinely transpired to Haley, the voice stated. I understand why she was executed, and I understand who commanded it. But I can only inform you in person, and I can only encounter you alone. Marlowe gazed across the burial ground toward the illuminations of Whitmore Academy, where fresh pupils were already settling into dormitories that had been thoroughly examined and monitored by federal agents. The immediate danger had been neutralized. Yet the mechanism that had generated that danger was adapting, evolving, readying fresh strategies to shield itself from future exposure. There exist certain conflicts that don't terminate when you prevail in them, she stated to Garrett subsequently that night. Both of them lying conscious in the darkness of their farmhouse bedroom, they simply relocate to different battlegrounds. Then we'll combat them on the fresh battlefield, he responded, his hand locating hers beneath the quilts that had been constructed by her grandmother during a different era of uncertainty and struggle. But this occasion, we'll understand what we're combating, and we won't be combating alone. Outside their window, the oak forest stood outlined against an atmosphere full of stars, its branches extending toward possibilities that neither of them could completely conceive. The cord was absent, removed by federal agents as proof. Yet the tree persisted as a monument to survival and the variety of fairness that sometimes necessitated ordinary people to risk everything for the opportunity to make extraordinary alteration.